We are about to embark on the third chapter of Rambam's Mishnah Torah, Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the laws of the fundamentals of Torah and Halacha. This chapter is quite unique, in which the Rambam, following what he said earlier, that our path to real love and awe of the Creator leads through seeing the divine wisdom which is infinite, that is embedded in creation. And therefore the Rambam said, I want to share principles about various aspects of our cosmos. The Rambam now continues to set forth the astronomical system, or some basic ideas of the astronomical system, as a continuation of the previous chapter. Before we actually begin inside, I think it's important to give somewhat of a brief introduction. It's quite noteworthy that the classic commentators of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah are silent in this chapter. Kesef Mishnah, Rabbi Yosef Karo, Magid Mishnah, Lechem Mishnah, Hagas Maimonides, Ravid. The classic commentators, you do have what's called the Pirush. The Pirush is a commentary on this section of the Rambam, and you have a few references from the Migdal Oz. But besides that, most of the commentators have not said anything. In fact, this chapter of Rambam, every chapter of Rambam came under microscopic scrutiny. This chapter of Rambam, however, came truly, if there was a chapter that was scrutinized under a microscope, or I should say in this case with a telescope, pun intended, it was this chapter of Rambam. Two major issues that has confronted many commentators, Jewish commentators, throughout the ages concerning this chapter of Rambam, I will outline very briefly. The first issue is, as the Rambam himself says, this is the system known as Maaseh Bereshis, the work of creation. Previous chapters, 1 and 2, was a system known as Maaseh Merkava, which means the workings of the chariot, understanding the divine relationship with creation. But this, chapter 3 and 4, is Maaseh Bereshis, the work of creation. The Rambam himself says, quoting a Mishnah in Masechta Chagiga, that these are secrets. And one has to know when to communicate them, how to communicate them, to whom to communicate them, as he will discuss at the end of the chapter and in chapter 4. If so, the question is, how can the Rambam then turn this chapter, in which he's discussing Maaseh Bereshis, into what Rabbi Yosef Irgus, he was one of the great mystics, Kabbalists, and philosophers, and halachic authorities, Rabbi Yosef Irgus, of the 18th century. He has a sefer called Shomer Emunim. And there he quotes other commentators saying, Aristotelian physics, that is Maaseh Bereshis, that is the secret of creation, of the work of creation that our sages were talking about. It seems like that the Rambam is just giving a description here of the way the Greeks understood astronomy in their time, including in the Rambam's time in the 12th century. And he's giving a summation of that system of astronomy. Rabbi Yosef Irgus quotes quite a few Jewish philosophers, mystics, Kabbalists, who say, this is the Maaseh Bereshis, this is basically the secrets of creation that the sages were talking about, and they limited and restricted how it should be taught and how it should be communicated. Basically, the Greek system of physics, Aristotle's system. Aristotle's system. That's question number one. Question number two is, a lot of the ideas and the facts, the scientific facts that the Rambam articulates, seems to be contradictory or completely inconsistent with what modern science, cosmology, astronomy, and physics has come to learn over the centuries since the Rambam. How does one deal with it? In other words, some of it, or much of it, or some say most of it, is inconsistent with reality. How do we confront this? A lot of ink has been spilled on this question. I should mention also a very brief but wonderful introduction by Rabbi Tauger, who translated the Rambam into English in the Miznayim Publishing House, and other articles and essays that were written about this. And briefly, there are two approaches. Approach number one, which you will read about in books, essays, articles, websites, hear lectures about, is don't hold the sages accountable for the fact that they embraced and reflected scientific knowledge the way it was taught in their times. The function of the Rambam or all of the sages through other generations is not to serve as scientists and astronomers and cosmologists. It's to serve as sages of Torah wisdom and Torah law. Yeah, when they spoke about science, they adopted the scientific method and the scientific knowledge and fact the way it was understood in their time. If at other times, as generations follow, that wisdom becomes obsolete and old theories are dismissed into the dustbin of history, so be it. It doesn't pose any serious existential, theological, intellectual problem in terms of Judaism. The Rambam clearly quotes, he says that the Greek scholars wrote many books about this, he's going to say later in this chapter. So he read those books and he followed that system of astronomy. Today, astronomy is understood in a completely different fashion. So be it. And they would continue to argue. I'm paraphrasing, I'm just developing this line of thought, which is very popular and common among many scholars. They would say, what's the Rambam trying to do here? He's not trying just to teach astronomy objectively. That's not what he's trying to do, giving you a class in science. This is a book of halacha. It's a book of Jewish law. The Rambam is trying to impress upon a person the infinite wisdom that's embedded in creation. Whatever model of astronomy you use, whatever model of cosmology you use, whatever level of science or physics you have known in the 12th century or in the 21st century, one thing is very obvious, that the laws of nature are rational. What's obvious is that there is a system. What's obvious is that the mathematical probabilities that all of this happened randomly is highly, highly, highly unlikely and mind-staggering in the faith that it just happened by mistake. And it all worked out with such perfect harmony and synchronization. Just the fact that our planet can support life, and that's just our planet. Never mind when you study the whole cosmos, beginning with the solar system, which the Rambam discusses here. So fine. There was the model, the geocentric model in the Rambam's days, and the heliocentric model in the contemporary times, or hundreds or thousands or millions of other differences. So those are all variations of how the human mind, through the instruments that it has at that time, can grasp reality based on its perspective. And we know that today's theories might also be dismissed by future discoveries and by future instruments that we may develop that today we simply have no access of finding certain truths about reality. That's what science is. Science never speaks in absolutes. If it speaks in absolutes, it's not science. Science is always seeking the truth, using the instruments available for scientists and cosmologists and physicists, the instruments that they have, using those instruments, trying to develop workable theories that are as consistent with truth as they can see at the time. Hence, scientific theories come and go constantly. That is the nature of science. So what do you want from the Rambam? The Rambam was presenting an elegant model of the universe the way he understood it at the time, based on the scientists and astronomers at the time. Today, we have a different model of the universe, so be, and in fact, the elegance only grows. The intricacies and the genius and the infinity of it, and the fact that all the laws of nature coming together, and the systems only become more impressive as time progresses, as I mentioned in the previous class. That's one way of looking at it, and therefore don't be bothered by any discrepancies, by what seems to be inaccurate, inconsistent, not true, etc. There's another approach that you will also hear and read in different books, hear different lectures. And that approach is a very different approach. I would say opposite approach. That approach is the Rambam was writing Torah. The sages in the Talmud are transcribing Torah. Torah is true. The fact that scientists say this is not the case, we don't look at that. Torah is immutable. There's divine inspiration here. It's absolutely authentic. It doesn't change with the ages. So science says, but now they discovered this, they discovered that. Don't even look at it. It's irrelevant to us. We can disregard it. We have one parameter of what truth is, and that is what it says in the Torah. Every other theory, I don't care if 1,000 people believe it, 1,000,000 people believe it, or 7.7 people believe it. This view says what the Torah says is true. The Rambam says here a certain model. This is how it is. Other people disagree with it. Most scientists say that's not the case, so they say so. We don't even have to consider it or look at it. We don't look at science. You see why I say this is the exact opposite approach of the first approach I said. And basically, this approach is saying that the works of our sages are completely representative of eternal truth. And therefore, the conclusions of science don't compete with it. They're only theories. Theories come and theories go. Theories are subject to changes in the light of new observations. And the end statement, the final statement, has not been written yet. Two very different and opposite approaches. Which one should we embrace in our class today? What would you say? Now, I think, truth be told, I'm presenting to you and trying to be as objective as possible, presenting to you different streams of thought within the Jewish world. And I'm, by the way, talking about even within the what you might call Orthodox, observant Torah world, you'll have these two streams of thought. And I speak to people, scholars, different perspectives, and they're often very, very emphatic about the authenticity of their view. Obviously, each one of these views leaves us with a gaping void, right? Or something that nags at us. It leaves us discontent. And we understand why. The second view, although it has an advantage, that it never affects Torah, the laws of Torah, the perspectives of Torah remain steadfast and completely immutable and untouchable, really, by dismissing anything in science that contradicts it. It still poses, I think, two major challenges. Challenge number one is, what do we do with all of the scientific progress? Just to tell a thinking person, especially a student of science, ignore it, dismiss it, it really robs so many intelligent people from the ability to be able to appreciate Torah. We force people into a corner and say, either choose this or choose that, but they can't both coexist. Maybe it works for some people, but we deprive maybe a whole generation, certainly hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, who are students of science, who are students of physics, who cherish science, who adore physics and cosmology and astronomy, etc., all the branches of science. And we almost deprive them from the ability to learn Rambam or to learn Gemara or learn other things wherever there's a contradiction. Is that really our duty? Is that really the ultimate authentic Jewish approach? Is the only way of embracing Torah is if we have to literally pit it against science and they become mutually exclusive, maybe not always, but at least frequently, or certainly not infrequently. That's problem number one. Problem number two, I would argue, is even deeper. Is it not only that we're doing an injustice to science, is it maybe that we're also doing an injustice to Torah, to Judaism? Because maybe by completely ignoring science, we deprive ourselves from the ability to actually understand Torah in a much deeper way. Perhaps the injustice that's perpetrated is also towards Torah because it boxes in Judaism into a view that is very absolute which is nice, but also maybe very narrow, maybe sometimes even primitive. Maybe our Judaism remains very superficial because we keep on our glasses that may be ancient and primitive and ancient, and therefore there is the test of time, which is nice, but it also may be primitive. Perhaps all of the developments of science, the scientific method, scientific progress, even if there may be mistakes, and science only speaks in terms of theories, but perhaps they can allow us to expand our perspective and see much more depth, maybe untold layers of depth in the wisdom of Torah, articulated in the literature of our Torah. Which now brings me to the second approach. The second approach also leaves us wanting, even though some people I know are emphatic fans, are great fans of this approach. But it basically opens up a very serious general question of how mistaken can the sages have been. So you'll say, well, when it comes to science, they were just reading what it said in the literature of the time or what they heard from scholars at the time, and therefore it could be a mistake. Okay. But there's also a lot of statements that they derived from various verses in the Torah, different interpretations. So we have to ask the question, did they really profess the ability to be so erroneous? And where does that stop? Because you could say maybe they made mistakes about other things, just like they can be deceived by the science of the time, even though it's completely not true. Maybe they made different types of mistakes, especially when they come to certain conclusions based on their logic, based on their deductions, based on how they read the Tanakh, and then you say, oh, the whole thing is a mistake. Maybe there's a lot of other mistakes. That's, I think, a fundamental issue with this approach. It becomes especially problematic with a book like Mishnah Torah. This is not just a book on astronomy, a book of philosophy, like the Guide to the Perplexed. This is the Rambam articulated in his introduction that this is, from his perspective, the ultimate book of halacha, of Jewish law. In fact, the complement, the second Mishnah Torah to Torah Shebeksav. You read the Tanakh, you read the Mishnah Torah, and you have the whole Torah. Wow. And the Rambam says this is a sefer halachos, meaning the Rambam is telling you that every word of this book is part of Jewish law, which is eternal, timeless, and immutable, as he himself is going to say later in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah. True, the Rambam wrote that he's teaching us principles in order to be able to appreciate God's wisdom, but he goes on to articulate those principles. The Rambam could have said, go study the principles about the world and you'll figure out God's wisdom. He doesn't do that. He sets forth a system of understanding reality. To say that that is completely erroneous. Everything can be thrown out in the face of truth today. I think it's an idea that is wanting, to put it mildly. It's deficient. Especially, and this is somewhat surprising, when it comes later in Rambam, and I've heard from people who've said the first 4 chapters of Mishnah Torah, it's somebody said, it's nicht the Rambam. It's not the Rambam. And I find that to be completely off mark. Because later halachas, you are going to take every word of the Rambam and dissect it more than the scientists dissect an atom and the solar system. The syllable in Rambam, a phrase in Rambam, a sentence in Rambam, the way the Rambam wrote it, this becomes not just important, it becomes fundamental perspectives on how to view halacha, how to learn a Gemara, how the Rambam defined the essence of the halacha. The Rambam is not just trusted, the Rambam is seen as the seminal, quintessential embodiment of Torah wisdom and the halachic perspective and the divine will in this world. And yet the first 4 chapters could just be, thrown under the bus and dismissed. Oh, yeah, it's just, Greek Baba Mises, Aristotle's Baba Mises. And I'm not here to give a definitive answer to this, but I'm just going to introduce 2 more ideas, 2 more approaches into this cholent. And the point here is not to give an authoritative answer, an ultimate solution to reconcile all of the paradoxes and contradictions. The idea is to open us up to the various modes of thinking and to be able to think about this in creative fashions and outside of the box. I'm going to introduce now a third idea. And the idea may be strange to some. Rabbi Tauger talks about this in his introduction to Yesodei HaTorah. But I do want to say that the nucleus of the idea is found by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Lotzato, the famous Ramchal, the author of the Mesilas Yesharim, Derech Hashem, Klach Pischei Chachma, many other works in Jewish philosophy and Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. He was the famous poet and playwright. He passed away in the 1740s from a pandemic in Tiberias in Tiberia. He was a young man, 39 I think. He and his whole family died. The Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Lotzato. He writes this in a commentary to the Idra, to a section in Zohar. It's in his manuscript. A similar pattern by the Vilna Gaon in a commentary on a section of Zohar called Sifra D'Tznius. So one of the most complex sections of Zohar, the Vilna Gaon has a commentary on it. Both quoted and explained by the famous Reb David Luria, one of the great Gaonim of Vilna in the 18th and 19th century. Reb David Luria, who wrote a commentary on Pirkei de Rebbe Lezer, and there he inserts it. This is the introduction because there's a few chapters on astronomy there. With more elaboration and a little bit from a different perspective, although not quite different. This approach was developed also, I heard it myself from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, about other Rambams. Rambam Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh, where he discusses the solar cycle, and Rambam Hilchos Deis, where he discusses the proper diet in order to maintain optimum health throughout your life. I will discuss it there too. But from all these different sources and other sources, there may be another approach. The approach is a profound one, and I would say a very spiritual one. The approach is, and it really answers both questions, both problems. The Rambam was not just articulating here a Greek system of astronomy, or as the Shemer Emunah Beis Avirga says, Aristotelian physics. No. The Rambam was articulating, as he himself will say at the end, secrets about the mystical spiritual energies of creation, about the divine inner spiritual system of creation, which is a basic fundamental idea that we see in the Rambam. There is a divine mind, intelligence, love, passion, wisdom, infinite wisdom behind every single nuance of every single being in existence and in the collective cosmos and in the collective planet. And the Rambam is articulating it. But as always in the works of the Rambam, he is using scientific language in the famous expression of the Gemara that he quoted earlier. Why we use anthropomorphic terms to describe God, God's eyes, Hashem's hands, Hashem's feet. Dibra Torah Kalashim B'nai Adam. The Torah employs human language. The Rambam is using terminology of science, of physics, of astronomy, similar but not an exact replica of much of Greek astronomy, similar in many aspects, but not identical in any way, using that to convey the spiritual workings of creation that are embedded in this terminology, which means it would be like a mashal versus a nimshal. A mashal is a metaphor, a parable, an allegory, but the parable hides within it an inner theme. The Rambam here is not just discussing the system of astronomy the way it was taught by the Greeks, as Reb Shlomo Ramonim says, so what are the secrets here? Why can't you teach it to everybody? It's not even Jewish astronomy. The Rambam is conveying here the divine, inner, mystical, spiritual energies behind creation, employing the language, the human language, the scientific language of astronomy to express it. In fact, there are statements here that come from the Zohar. We don't have that in the Talmud and the Medrash. We find them articulated in the Zohar. And there's another interesting thing. There is the commentary called Kiryas Melech. And the Kiryas Melech cites sources from the Zohar, from many of the halachas in these chapters. Now, what's the Zohar? The Zohar is a work of Kabbalah. It's the basic work of Jewish mysticism, of Jewish spirituality. This is the big question that the Rambam see the Zohar. Rambam didn't see the Zohar. I discussed it in an earlier class. But here he cites many sources for these halachas in the Zohar or other Kabbalistic works. They're talking about the spiritual, divine energy embedded in creation. Is the Rambam then using scientific terminology and physical, corporal terms in order to convey the secrets of creation? So this is not just Aristotelian physics. This is Torah physics. This is the spirituality of physics. This is divine physics. And as the Vilna Gaon says, and Moshe Chaim Luzzatto says, and the fact that sometimes physical observations may be inconsistent with this does not require of us to dismiss science and negate science and say, yeah, it's garnished, it's garbage. No. Does the spiritual system always manifest itself in the physical system? Not necessarily. Sometimes the spiritual system and the physical system can be in a state of dissonance. Or sometimes the spiritual system is manifested in the physical system in a different fashion. So when we say sun, when we say moon, when we say planet, when we say stars, when we say motion, when we say spheres, are we describing physical realities or spiritual realities? Ramchal says sometimes we're describing spiritual realities using the language of metaphor. And in the spiritual reality, the physics is exact. It's accurate. Sometimes we can see it in the very physical sense, and sometimes not. Sometimes there's dissonance between the way it is in the spiritual physics and in the physical physics. This principle will be alluded to at different points in Mishnah Torah, not often, but a few times. As I told you, Hilchos Deis, Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh. We'll discuss it also with Birchas Hachama, the blessing we make once in 28 years. What happens once in 28 years? There's a similar problem there, a similar discrepancy there, and this theme is going to come up another few times. It's a very fascinating theme. There's another important point to make. And the other important point to make is, it's important not to be closed-minded in science as well. Now, you might have found that surprising. Of course not. But sometimes scientists can also get stuck. They get stuck in a certain development and they're not ready to escape that. By most of us, the geocentric model that Ptolemy embraced, which sees the Earth as the center of the universe and all of the planets rotating about the Earth, has been dismissed in the 15th century by Copernicus, and the Copernican model completely dismissed the ancient model as archaic, as old-fashioned, as ridiculous, as absurd. And therefore, there's a new model. And the new model is the halocentric model, in which the sun is actually the center and the Earth rotates around the sun. The sun doesn't rotate around the Earth rotates around the sun. This has become the new model. I was teaching the other day, I was teaching some time ago to our Chevre Masechta Rosh Hashanah, Talmud Rosh Hashanah. So beginning from page 11, Yud Aleph, and further, there's a lot of astronomy. Because, of course, a lot of the Masechta is about establishing the new month, the new moon. So there's a lot there about the constellations, about the solar system, the lunar system. There's also about the various constellations, Mazel Chima. It's Lebedik and Freilich with astronomy there. So I was looking at the various, contemporary translations and pictures and explanations. It's not easy to teach. It's not easy to understand. So there is the Art Scroll, the famous celebrated Art Scroll Gemara, and there's the famous celebrated Mesivta Gemara. Both Masechta Rosh Hashanah. Art Scroll has in Hebrew and in English, and the Mesivta has in Hebrew, and Mesivta comes with a beautiful album with a lot of images and pictures, three-dimensional, a lot of them, and Art Scroll has its pictures. Both did a magnificent job, each one in their own style. Beautiful, beautiful job. But as I was reading it, I saw that in the Mesivta Gemara, they maintained the geocentric model, which is the literal, straightforward interpretation of our tradition. The Gemara in a few places, in Rosh Hashanah and other places, and Talmud Yerushalmi and Medrash, embraced the idea that Ha'aretz Lo'olam Ha'medes, Ecclesiastes says, Koheles says, the earth stands, and the sun rotates around the earth. And the other planets as well. The Art Scroll Gemara says that's all the appearance. In their translation, they say that's from our appearance. When we look out, when we watch the sunrise, the sun is rising in the east and the sun is setting in the west. But of course, the actual reality is that something else is happening, that the earth is rotating, it's spinning on its axis. And as a result of that, we are perceiving the sun, the moon, the stars rising in the east and setting in the west. Even though the sun is not rising and the sun is not moving, the earth is rotating on its axis, and the earth is also revolving around the sun in the annual cycle. In the annual revolution, this earth revolving around the sun. So this is a very classic example. It's a classic example of here you have two models. And what they're saying is the Torah is addressing our perspective. It looks like the sun is rising and the sun is setting. The Mesivta Gemara, they just went the literal approach. Now it's very obvious when you learn Rambam, he is embracing emphatically the geocentric model. And this creates a big problem. The geocentric model of the sun revolving around the earth. Earth stationary and the sun revolving around the earth, rising in the east, setting in the west, and also revolving around the earth in the opposite direction, making a rotation over 365 days revolving around the earth. How does one reconcile this? Are we following the ancient Ptolemy model that has been dismissed, or the heliocentric model of Copernicus beginning with the 1400s? So we would see here would be a real discrepancy. And it's here, I want to quote something that's extremely fascinating. Now, I have to say the truth. I don't really understand this. I am not a scientist. I am not a cosmologist. I still have a problem wrapping my brain around Einstein's theories of general relativity and specific relativity. So I am not speaking to you as an expert of somebody who understands this. I'm just quoting sources that are very fascinating and interesting, and I think we have to all be curious and inquisitive and at least open to these possibilities and not remain stuck in dogma based on preconceived notions and then just follow confirmation bias. Albert Einstein had a student in Berlin. His name was Hans Reichenbach. Reichenbach has majored in philosophy, but he was also a practicing engineer and quite a celebrated physicist. He sat at the feet of Albert Einstein, I believe, for 4 years, studying with him and under him his theory of relativity. He then went on to write his own books about physics and science, geometry, space and time, published in Berlin in Germany in the 1920s. Hans Reichenbach. I want to quote here a line from one of his works. Fascinating line. And this is somebody who Einstein held in high regard. I believe he secured his position as a professor, assistant professor of physics in the celebrated University of Berlin. So he wasn't a Katlakanya, he wasn't a Psa. I'm going to quote. Reichenbach has a book, it's written in German, Philosophy of Space and Time, published in Berlin in 1928, and I quote word for word in English translation. Hans Reichenbach. The relativity theory of dynamics is not a purely academic matter. It upsets the Copernican worldview. It is meaningless to speak of a difference in truth claims of the theories of Copernicus and Ptolemy. The two conceptions are equivalent descriptions. What has been considered the greatest discovery of Western science compared to antiquity is now denied its claim to truth. The Copernican model has been so revolutionary, as he says, it's been considered the greatest discovery of Western science. He's writing in 1928. He says now, it's not, you can't say it's true anymore. The theory of relativity does not say that the conception of Ptolemy is correct. It doesn't say that the sun rotates around the earth. Rather, it contests the absolute significance of either's theory. And he writes, Reichenbach writes, Newton decided in favor of Copernicus from the point of view of dynamics. It was only for this particular world description that his theory of gravitation offered a mechanical explanation. The complicated planetary orbits of Ptolemy, on the other hand, did not fit into any explanation. If we wish to establish the equivalence of both world conceptions, we must find a theory of gravitation sufficiently general to explain the Copernican and also the Ptolemy's planetary motion as a gravitational phenomenon. Here is the great achievement of Einstein. Einstein has indeed found such a comprehensive theory of gravitation. It is with this discovery, which places him on the same plane as Copernicus and Newton, that the problem of the relativity of motion has been brought to its conclusion. So basically, he's saying that the Copernican view of planets orbiting the sun has been accepted as true from a certain worldview, that of motion and dynamics. If one accepted Ptolemy and the Rambam's argument that the Earth lies in the center, then the resulting planetary and solar orbits would be very messy. And they wouldn't be able to be explained elegantly. This would be uncomfortable from the Newtonian dynamic worldview, but not in Einstein's universe, which was seen through the eyes of gravitational pull. I think this is extremely important to remember when we discuss this, and we're going to discuss the Rambam's worldview. I'm also going to share with you a very interesting story, which I read in a biography, Rabbi Chaim Miller's biography of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, called Turning Judaism Outward. It's a fantastic story. I want to share it with you. I really appreciated it. There's a Jew, he lives in Brighton Beach. I happen to know him. His name is Rabbi Feivel Rimler, a Rav in Brighton Beach for many years. In 1975, he encountered an intelligent skeptic, a secular Jew, who was either a scientist or a physicist or well familiar with it. And they began discussing the two models. So this fellow, who was an educated man, he said, listen, it's impossible. He said, you're a Chabadnik. It's impossible that the Lubavitcher Rebbe would embrace the outdated belief. Obviously, he rejects it. Rabbi Rimler tells him, no, I think that the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually embraces the idea of the sun and the planets rotating around the earth. So the man says to him, I am saying to you, and I will submit it in writing, if the Rebbe would make a public statement to the effect that since the Talmud states that the sun revolves around the earth, it's therefore his firm belief that the sun does indeed revolve around the earth, I promise, I will, number one, personally observe the laws of family purity, mikveh, and tefillin, and Shabbos. Immediately, I'll start putting on tefillin, I'll start keeping Shabbos, and I'll follow the laws of family purity, and I will influence my friends and colleagues to do the same. However, of course, it's more than obvious to me that the Rebbe would not in any way make such a ridiculous statement, because number one, he does not wish to be labeled as a fool, and number two, he himself is not a fool at all, and he's not foolish as some of his ardent but hypnotized followers. I predict with no hesitation that I will not hear any more about this matter from you or from the Rebbe or through the press, because it's obvious the Rebbe was educated in college, and he himself would never ever embrace such a view. Rabbi Rimler shared this letter with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a letter from the Rebbe to this man, penned on the 5th of November, 75. The Rebbe writes, "It is my firm belief that the sun revolves around the earth. I have also declared this publicly on various occasions and in discussion with professors specializing in this field of science. In view of the above, I have no objection, of course, if you wish to make this view known to whoever you choose." And the Rebbe now hopes that the Jew will start putting on tefillin and celebrating Shabbos and keeping the laws of family purity. In a separate document, the Rebbe said he didn't want to confuse the two documents. He writes as follows, I quote, "One of the conclusions of the theory of relativity is that when there are two systems or planets in motion relative to each other, such as the sun and the earth in our case, either view, namely the sun rotating around the earth or the earth rotating around the sun, has equal validity. Every person, including modern scientists, actually has three options to choose from in this matter. A, that A revolves around B, B, that B revolves around A, C, that A and B revolve around each other, but such a choice cannot be dictated by science. It would be one's personal choice and belief." Now, it's true that this new trend in science has been ignored, to the dismay of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, as he writes in the letter and other letters, but this is, I think, a very fascinating idea that we should keep in mind. There's another very important idea to keep in mind here. And here I'm going to quote from Rabbi Tauger's introduction to this chapter in Rambam. When we learn the Rambam, it's going to be obvious that the Rambam's interpretations of the spheres are material entities. He doesn't only see stars and planets. He sees spheres. In fact, he's going to give the number of the spheres. And these are like balls, circles, balls, that encompass the planets, that encompass the stars. And he speaks of the spheres as material entities. What appears to us today is that they are nothing more than empty space in which the planets revolve. The orbit of the planets is an empty space. The Rambam believes that they are material entities. He even describes what they're made up of. This seems completely outdated, to say the least. But let's now think about one thing. According to the general theory of relativity, within a gravitation field, there is no such thing as empty space. Gravity wraps space and causes it to be defined as a specific entity. The planet's movements are therefore a function of the geometry of space. In this conception, the orbit of each planet exists as a distinct entity, but altogether different from entities that exist in our world. Because, of course, when we speak about gravity which warps space, it causes it to be defined as a specific entity, but it's not exactly the entities that we're familiar with in our world. But it would mean that the orbit of each planet exists as a distinct entity, not just as empty space. Now, how different is that from the Rambam statement, who says that the spheres are entities whose matter and manner of existence is of a completely different nature from that of the creations of our world? Important to take note. A third point. The four fundamental elements the Rambam is going to be addressing in chapter 3 and 4. Fire, wind, or air, water, and earth. Eish, fire. Ruach is wind. Mayim is water, and Afar is earth. Here again, who speaks about this? In chemistry, we speak about fire, water. Again, Greek ideas. The truth is, we have to realize that this is something that's mentioned often in Medrash. It's mentioned in Zohar. It's mentioned in a lot of sources in Judaism, not only in Kabbalah, but also in texts of Medrash. In the writings of Kabbalah, this is a fundamental idea because it corresponds to the four names of God. Yud, Hey, the four letters of God's name, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, corresponds to the four worlds, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Asiyah, and corresponds to many parallels of four in Judaism. And as I said, it's mentioned not once or twice, numerous times in Medrash and Zohar. So just to dismiss it as garnished, as meaningless, is quite problematic. But here it's important to say something. When we study chapter 4, we see that when the Rambam is referring to the four elements, he's not referring to these four substances as we see them before us. What fire is observed, what fire means to us, and wind, and water, and earth. Completely not. It's conceivable that he's speaking of four states of matter. The solid state, the liquid state, the gaseous state, and the kinetic state in which matter is transformed into energy. So when you have Afar, you have Mayim, you have Ruach, and you have Eish, it's four states of matter. There's the solid state, Afar, the liquid state, Mayim, the gaseous state, which is Ruach, and then you have the kinetic state in which matter becomes, it's metamorphosized into energy, which is Eish. Another component of this has been suggested. Some say that the four elements today is matter, antimatter, positive and negative. That's also Daled Yesodei. Matter, antimatter, positive and negative. Another important component to understand is when they speak about Yesodei, you shouldn't confuse it with chemistry. We're not talking about the ultimate particles that make up matter in its most fundamental element. They're not saying that these cannot be further divisible into smaller and smaller elements and particles. That's also an important element to understand. These are just some observations that I think are good to maintain when we are embarking on chapter 3 and 4 from Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah. I think my time is up now. So I'm going to, we'll take a break, and Be'ezer Hashem, we will continue tomorrow. Have a beautiful day. Remember tomorrow's schedule. Tomorrow morning, 7:30, the Maimer, Chassidus, and 10 o'clock a.m. we'll continue Rambam, and we will learn chapter 3 of Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah. Have a beautiful day. Let me take questions. I will take questions. Particles that make up matter in its most fundamental element. They're not saying that. Okay, here we go. Let's see what's going on. Somebody comments, there's a sefer called Zohar HaRambam. Zohar Rambam chapter 5, which discusses Maaseh Bereshis and Maaseh Merkava according to the Rambam. And the man did quite a fine job in compilation of sources. Okay, this is very interesting. Somebody writes, in 1969, in August, man landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. It was a monumental achievement for mankind. Leading Torah scholars of the time were very impressed, like everybody else in the world. Here are some very interesting reactions to the event. Rabbi Herschel Schechter writes in the name of Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, Beis Yitzchak Journal, 5754, number 26. Rabbi Soloveitchik was asked about Judaism's view of man's traveling to the moon. The questionnaire, suspecting that it might be forbidden, because doesn't it say in Tehillim, the heavens are God's, but the land he gave to mankind? Rabbi Soloveitchik responded, one can distinguish in the definition of heavens and earth. The term heavens can be explained in two ways. As something high and distant, like we say, Loi Bashamayim, Torah is not in heaven. It means it's not remote and distant, according to which the moon is considered as part of the heavens. Alternatively, the term can be defined as including everything that is beyond human understanding, including the entire spiritual realm. According to the second understanding, the stars and most distant galaxies, and certainly the moon, are considered part of Earth, because we can relate to them, we can study them, we can see them, we can observe them, we can analyze them as we can analyze things on the Earth. Therefore, according to this interpretation, there's no contradiction between traveling in space, scientific studies of the cosmos, and the verse, the heavens are the Lord and the land is for mankind, because in this sense, moon is part of the human domain. Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, Emes LeYaakov al HaTorah in Bereshis. We learn from these words of the Ramban, says Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, and in particularly from what he concluded in the continuation of his words on verse 8, Genesis chapter 1, that everything that exists in the creation of the entire world, including the sun, the moon, all the heavenly hosts, are not called heavens. The heavens are only things that have no physical bodies, such as angels, chayos, merkava. However, whatever has a physical body is included in the name earth in verse 1. Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'sa'aretz. These words of the Ramban are what carried me when we saw men descending from a spaceship on a ladder onto the surface of the moon. I thought to myself, what would the Rambam, who wrote that the moon has a spiritual form, answer now? I thought that at that point Kabbalah defeated philosophy, and comforted myself with the words of the Ramban. We are forced to say that what the Rambam told us in these chapters, chapter 1 and 4, is neither Maaseh Merkava nor Maaseh Bereshis. Rather, he wrote these 4 chapters from his deep mind and from his knowledge of secular wisdom, not for the wisdom of Torah, but only from philosophy. And the Rambam only wrote these as an introduction to the Mishnah Torah. The main part of the book begins with chapter 5. Rabbi Menachem Kasher tries to defend the Rambam, but I see it as forced and bizarre. So here you have a classic example of the view that I discussed earlier. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky says that the first 4 chapters are not really Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. I mean, they are, but he doesn't take them so seriously. Because the Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky understood that the Rambam says that the moon has a spiritual form, and therefore, how could you land on the moon if it's a spiritual form? But really, the moon is a physical, and therefore it's part of the earth, it's not part of heaven. But the truth is, I don't understand this, because the Rambam doesn't say that the moon is spiritual. The Rambam says that the matter of the moon is not like our matter. That the physical form of the moon is not like things below on planet Earth. That's what the Rambam says. That the Rambam says that by us, the body and the soul, it's always changeable. The body decomposes and it dies, and everything changes, goes through a flux. But the heavenly planets and stars don't go through that change. It remains fixed. Now, the moon remains fixed for thousands of years. It's the same moon. It doesn't go through those vicissitudes that human bodies or animal bodies or trees, vegetation, or metals go through on planet Earth. That's what the Rambam says. But I don't know why Rabbi Yaakov thought that the Rambam says that the moon is spiritual and therefore you can't land on the moon. I don't think the Rambam says that anywhere, so I'm not sure what he means. I don't know why he would say that, and then he has to question the Rambam. I don't understand. Rabbi Menachem Kasher, Ha'adam al Hayareach, chapter 4. Is it correct what many are currently saying, that when man reached the moon and dug from it dirt and stones, it was proven wrong what the Rambam says in Mishnah Torah chapter 3 and Moreh Nevuchim section 2.5, and brings proof to Aristotle's position from biblical verses of the sages that the heavenly spheres have souls, knowledge and understanding, and live, stand, and recognize he who said and the world came into being? That the Rambam says. The Rambam says that the heavenly spheres have souls, and they are aware, and they recognize God. I wrote that the early sages of Sadia Gaon, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, Rabbi Yesodei Kraskus, Rabbi Yitzchak Ibn Latif, the author of Akedas Yitzchak, end of essay 1, and that Barbanel strongly reject the position of Aristotle and the Rambam. Rabbi Yaakov Emden, in his book Migdal Oz, writes about Aristotle's position. It is all nonsense and lies. Maharal wrote in his introduction to the book Voris Hashem that the Rambam's position is nonsense. It's not true. In the pamphlet Gulas Yisrael of the Maggid of Koznitz, the author attempts to defend the Rambam. He explains that the heavenly spheres are intellectual without free will. We can explain this idea based on what Reb Chaim Vital wrote in his book Shari Kedusha, based on Kabbalah, that just like there is a soul in a living creature, there's also a soul in an inanimate object. Arizal says that even a rock has a soul. This is also the force that combines the four elements, the divine force. The position of the Rambam is that just like there is knowledge and intelligence among the angels, which does not refer to intellect that we have, that's connected to five senses, but rather it's a spiritual intellect according to their level. We can say the same for Toihu, the first power created by the will of God that remains forever in various forms, at first in Boihu, the atom, and later in elements and bodies. This force is also called an angel because it is an agent of God to be made into matter. It's not impossible that this force has its own intellect and rules according to its level and recognizes its creator and master. So I don't see the problem with the Rambam. In other words, just like there's angels that have intelligence, even though they don't have physical brains, there is spiritual intellect. We could say the first power created by the will of God that remains forever in forms. It's the atom, it's the other elements and the other bodies. It still retains that intelligence. We can add that the intellect of an atom, of an item, is the rules by which it acts with God's will, according to God's will. And it's the essence of its existence. The soul of an item is the force that preserves its existence with God's will. And that's the energy inside of it. The fact that the atom follows certain rules and it feels that it has to follow those rules. It's not just blind mechanics without any awareness. That's what the Rambam means. This is God's will that's infused in this. It's a certain intelligence that God infuses with it, and that's the essence of its existence. That's the soul, and that's the force that preserves its existence. And its existence is according to God's will and the energy inside of it. I came across another rabbinic response to the moon landing that takes a different approach. Rabbi Shlomo Volba, the famous Baal Mussar, in a talk, Shabbos Kiseitzi, 1969, Das Shloime, Maimer Yemei Ratzon, page 81. Unapologetically and unself-consciously, he said how the astronauts were quarantined for 21 days after returning to Earth to ensure that no alien bacteria or viruses came back with them. He suggested if there were spiritual beings on the moon, they would have quarantined the astronauts upon landing to ensure that they were not bringing any bacteria of lack of God-fearing, any contamination of irreligiosity. The Chavetz Chaim had been the first to land on the moon, he would have seen a pure landscape entirely untainted by irreligiosity, perhaps even attaining the level of prophecy. I find this characteristic of his Mussar personality, using contemporary events to illustrate a spiritual point. I also find it noteworthy that Rabbi Volba saw no religious challenge in this monumental event, referring to it without skeptical disclaimers or intellectual alarm. Instead, he found a Mussar aspect which could further